Okay, well thank you guys again for coming. This is Mr. Zawacki, and today what we're going to be talking about is a lot of information from Module 5 for biology about evolution and the diversity of living things. All right, first of all, before we get into it, you got to know what evolution is, right? And that's a very important thing because a lot of people don't really know what that word means. So up top, it's just a change in features of a species over time. All that means is that species change over time. That's it. Every single species on Earth, whether it be a butterfly, a bird, a human, an elephant that you see here, it doesn't matter, even a bacteria. Every living thing has changed over time, at least a little bit. And this just shows you an example with an elephant. Down here is your common ancestor, and over time, this branched off to form new species of elephants. Maybe this elephant went north into the mountains. Maybe the second elephant kind of stayed where it is. Maybe this elephant went to a desert area. Maybe this elephant went, to Asia or Africa, as we have today. So as you can see, every single species, including the elephant that we show here, has changed over time. It starts with a common ancestor, but then once that common ancestor branches off to other locations, it can form new species, like you see right here. Today, in the present, we have two species, the Asian and African elephants. In previous times, we had way more, but most of them have gone extinct. All right, so how did this theory of evolution come about? Well, we're only on our second slide. So how did this theory of evolution come about? Well, it all started with a mistake, actually. Lamarck, in 1809, about 200 years ago, he was a French scientist. He thought that children would have characteristics that parents develop during their lives, like acquiring the characteristics, like, for example, if a giraffe sticks its head out and stretches it over its lifetime, it'll become taller and then pass down that trait. Well, that's kind of close, but it was rejected after scientists learned more about genes and chromosomes. The DNA, or the genetic information, actually gets passed down. Lamarck was wrong because he thought that that species changed during its life. But it actually changed as it was being born with new DNA. So Lamarck was not the successful one in figuring out the theory of evolution, but this guy was, and you know him, Charles Darwin. So about 30, 40 years later, after Lamarck, Darwin went as a naturalist on a boat called the HMS Beagle to the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. And he knew that species that lived on the Galapagos Islands, they had to have come from Central or South America originally, yet they were very different than what was in Central and South America. And they had never seen these species before. They were very unique. So he came up with the idea that species have changed over time. They went to the Galapagos, they adapted to their environment, and they changed over time and passed down those changes to other offspring. So that's how the theory of evolution really was adapted, by Charles Darwin going around on a boat for several years in the mid-1800s. So you have to ask yourself, well, where's the proof behind the theory of evolution? How do we know that species change over time? How do we know that species come from a common ancestor and then branch out like that picture of elephants? Well, here's your evidence. There are at least 5 big ones that you guys need to know and be able to talk about during our DBA. So those 5 are fossils, homologous features, vestigial structures, embryology, and DNA. So to put it all, kind of break down one by one for you. Fossils, that's the easiest one. If you dig up a fossil of an old dead, extinct organism, you can probably just look at it and see how things have changed with that species over time. Maybe its legs gotten longer, or its neck got longer, or its teeth got different. Anything. But fossils will show you that species have changed. They can tell you the close to age, or the relative age, by looking at superposition, which means the oldest stuff is on the bottom, the youngest stuff is on top. That makes sense. Or they can figure out the exact age of the fossil by looking at its atoms, how much carbon is in it. So that they can figure out too. Either way, fossils is proof of evolution. Homologous features is another one. These are body parts that are similar in origin and function. Did you know that a bird wing, a bat wing, a dolphin flipper, even our hand, we all have the same exact number of bones, muscles, and blood vessels in our hand as a bird does in a wing, or as a bat does in a wing, or as a dolphin does in a flipper. We all have the same number of bones. What does that tell us? Well, we all probably adapted and changed from a common ancestor millions of years ago that we all have in common. Same thing with vestigial structures. That's more proof. We have a tailbone, but we don't use a tail or have a tail. We have an appendix, but we don't use that anymore. Snakes have leg bones, but they don't walk. A whale has hip bones, but it doesn't walk. Many other animals have structures inside of them that they don't use anymore. Well, that's proof that, guess what? These species have changed over time. So vestigial structures, or body parts that we have that we don't use anymore, those are also proof for evolution. Embryology is another one. You and I were embryos about 8 months before we were born. So very, very early we were an embryo, before we looked like a human. And believe it or not, if you study the embryo of a human, a bird, a reptile, a fish, and a mammal, unless you're really good at embryology, you won't be able to tell the difference. All embryos look the same. So that tells us that we all developed, at least originally, the same. So we may have all came from a common ancestor millions of years ago. And then the other proof is DNA. Organisms that are closely related have similar DNA. We have 99% the same DNA as a chimpanzee. We're almost identical to a chimpanzee DNA-wise. We still have 50% the same DNA as a chimpanzee, or sorry, as a plant. So 50% the same DNA as a plant, 99% the same DNA as a chimpanzee. Well, what can you say there? All living things have at least some DNA in common. So maybe we all evolved from an original strand of DNA, millions, if not billions of years ago. So fossils, things change over time. You can see it. Homologous features, similar structures, different functions, like the hand and the arm and the wing all having the same number of bones. Vestigial structures, structures that we have that we don't use anymore. Embryos, all embryos look the same when they are beginning to grow. And DNA, we have a similar DNA to every single living thing on Earth, at least some. So all of this is proof that A, species change over time, and B, if you go back in time, species converge to a common ancestor, which means we all evolved from common ancestors millions of years ago. So here again are the ones we talked about: vestigial organs, the DNA and genetic codes. Well, through experimenting, you can also prove it. Speciation, which I talked about, fossil records, transitional forms, like in looking at comparative anatomy. All of these are evidences for evolution, for sure. The main ones you want to discuss are these 5 right here. Okay, just to show you on pictures. Remember I said for evidence for homologous features? Well, it's the same thing as anatomy. Here we go. A bat wing, same number of bones. Whale, same number of bones. A cat paw and leg, same number of bones. Human arm and wrist, same number of bones. They're just organized differently. Here's embryos. Here is a fish embryo. Here is a salamander embryo. Here is, I can't really read that one, but some sort of organism here. Here is a chicken embryo, a hog embryo, a calf embryo, a rabbit embryo, a human embryo. If you look, all the embryos, as they were really, really young before they were born, all embryos start off the same. So that tells us that we all develop the same way. So we may all have similar DNA as well, which we do. And as you can see, oh yeah, good job. This should say tortoise, so that's a reptile. But anyways, as you can see, as it progresses, yeah, this looks more like a human, and yeah, this looks more like a salamander. But at the beginning, it's really hard to tell the difference. And that's why embryos are evidence for evolution. Here's your DNA. Look, us and a monkey, we almost have identical DNA. We're like 99% the same. That even us compared to a frog, we still have almost 50% the same DNA. Or humans to a weird-looking organism called a lamprey, we still share DNA with that. So what that is trying to say is maybe we all evolved from a common ancestor that had combinations of all of that millions of years ago. Fossils too. By looking at fossils of horses that have gone extinct over time, we can see that the horse has changed from a much smaller version to a larger wild version of horse by studying its fossils. So the horse has changed over time. How do we know that? Because of fossils. It tells you. So that's evidence right there for evolution, that the horse has changed over time. So all of those are proofs, guys, and that's what I want you to get from 501. That theory of evolution just says that species change over time. Where's the evidence behind that? How do we know that? Well, fossils, DNA, embryos, anatomy, vestigial structures, all of those are proof that species do change over time. That's why it's called the theory of evolution. Okay. So switching gears to 502, then you learned about this term called natural selection. You got to know what that is and know and be able to explain an example of it. Natural selection is just simply organisms with the best traits will probably survive and pass down those best traits, whereas organisms with the not so good traits probably won't make it, and they'll probably die because they don't have the best traits in the wild. It's sad, but it's true. The ones with the best traits survive and pass it down. The ones with the not so good traits don't survive and don't pass down those traits. It happens in 4 steps. First of all, we'll talk about giraffes, since we're on that. A giraffe mother will try to produce as many offspring as possible, 5 to 10 babies maybe in a lifetime. So overproduction is first, because she knows that not all 10 babies are going to grow up to be adults, at least for wild animals. So overproduction happens first. Make as many offspring as possible. Second step is variation. Even though she has 10 babies, 5 of them may look like mom and dad. The other 5 may be a little bit different. Maybe one is quicker, one is faster, one is taller, something like that. Third, if those differences are a good thing, like a giraffe being taller, well, that would be also called an adaptation. because now that tall giraffe can eat higher in the trees that its brothers and sisters can't, and it can probably see predators from further away. So if it's a good thing that they're different, it's an adaptation. If it's a bad thing that they're different, it's called a mutation. So kind of different. Either way, variation means different. Adaptation is a good thing for being different. So then, once adaptation happens, well, those offspring that don't have the adaptation may die off. But the ones with the new adaptation may live longer and reproduce more. That's called selection. Put it all together, you have natural selection of overproduction, variation, adaptation, and selection. It all means the organisms with the best traits survive and pass it down. The organisms with the bad traits don't survive and don't pass it down. Give you an example here. With snails, well, overproduction. The snails are going to produce as many babies as possible. Variation. Some of those babies are different. Red shell, yellow shell, greenish shell. Then, through adaptations, we've noticed that the brown shells have an advantage, and maybe the green shell has an advantage. So those have the advantage, whereas the yellow one does not. So that one does not get passed down, but the red shell will be passed down because it has an advantage, maybe camouflage, and same thing with this shell. The best suited variations are going to be able to produce more offspring. That's what you do in your 5.02 lab. You actually show that and model that with the activity that you do. Okay. So then, just to cover up the last couple things in lesson 3, there are 2 ways evolution can happen. One is gradualism, or very slow. Gradual means slow changes of the species to another, or it can happen overnight sometimes. Something is born so different that it causes rapid evolution, and it comes from mutations or changes in DNA, just a few genes. So if the species is born with just something so different, but it's an adaptation, well, then that's called punctuated equilibrium. Or it can change very slowly over time, which is gradualism. Here's gradualism. The dark green butterfly slowly but surely can adapt to an orange butterfly, or slowly and surely evolve to a purple butterfly. Whereas most case scenarios are punctuated equilibrium, where the butterfly will quickly have a mutation change to orange. Some of them will continue on, or change quickly again to purple, and then will continue on. So it just depends on the type of evolution. Punctuated equilibrium is very fast, overnight sometimes. Phyletic gradualism is shorter, or it takes a much longer time. Gradual changes. And then the last slide I'm going to show you then before we do our FCAT question and follow-up is this. This shows a good graphic of how we evolved as humans. Take a look up here. Here's our 4 closest neighbors in terms of our DNA. Chimpanzee is number 1. We are closely related to the chimpanzee more than any other animal on Earth. Number 2, bonobo. Number 3, gorilla. Number 4, orangutan. Those are our 4 closest relatives on Earth. But let me tell you, because you see some graphics sometimes and it might mislead you, we did not evolve from any of those animals. None of them. But all of us evolved from a common ancestor millions of years ago. So let's go back here to about 10 million years ago. 10 million years ago, there was a species on Earth called, it was a certain type of hominin called Australopithecus. And it looked kind of like a human, kind of like a bonobo, kind of like a chimpanzee, kind of like a gorilla, kind of like an orangutan, but it had all of that. And it was kind of just its own species that lived 10 million years ago. Well, some of that species decided to move more into a certain area, and it branched off to form the orangutan. And then another species stayed still, and it formed its own species. Then, 2 million years passes, we have now an orangutan and another common ancestor. That common ancestor, about 7 or 8 million years ago, decided to, some of them wanted to go live in the jungle, and some of them decided to stay still. And that's how you get the gorilla and the orangutan and another common ancestor from 5 million years ago. Then about 5 million years ago, another species decided to leave Africa area and go explore further and further away, which later turned out to be the human. And then another species decided to branch off and stay and go into another area of Africa. And then over that span of time, that common ancestor branched off to form the bonobo and chimpanzee, both also living in Africa. Whereas the human decided to migrate out of Africa and begin its own journey through other means, like the Neanderthals and the hominid species we have today. So we did not evolve from any of those animals you see. We all evolved from common ancestors that went extinct either 1 million years ago, or 5 million years ago, or 8 million years ago, or 11 million years ago, and it keeps going back. And that's what the whole human evolution kind of looks like. So I hope that makes sense. All right, so here's an FCAT question. We'll do A, B, C, or D. I want you to read it, and using the poll, tell me which one you think it is, A, B, C, or D. And the poll is up whenever you're ready to use it. A, B, C, or D. It's a little A box right above your name. Do about 10 more seconds for those of you who haven't answered yet. Okay. So it looks pretty common sense here. Yes, those dark-colored mice, they're better able to hide from predators, and the white ones are getting picked off. So the dark-colored mice have a better adaptation. That's why they're able to survive. So good job answering that. So now just a couple of follow-up questions for you guys to type in the chat box. Can every one of you list at least 2 evidences for evolution? What are 2 things that scientists look at that proves evolution? We talked about 5 or 6, so can you just tell me 2? Good job, Talea. Good job. We got fossils, DNA, embryos, vestigial structures. Good job. Don't forget comparing anatomy, homologous structures, and comparing bone structures. That's another one. But yeah, it looks like you guys got them. Natural selection is actually just one way on how evolution occurs. It's not really proof that evolution is there. It's just a way to explain how evolution happens. So yes, good job there. Another question, who remembers the 4 parts of natural selection? What is step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4 of natural selection? We got overproduction, that's first. Then variation. Yeah, what's after variation? Yep, adaptation. Remember having a good variation. And then the last part, it's the word with it. Yep, selection. Think of OVAS, I guess. Overproduction, variation, adaptation, and selection. OVAS, OVAS. Okay? All right, well, good job, guys. I hope you learned something today. 501, know about the theory of evolution and the evidence behind it. 502, know about natural selection and the parts of how it happens. And then 503, know about primate evolution and how things change over time. Okay? So good job, guys. I marked you all down for attendance. So you guys can go ahead and feel free to go whenever you're done. And thank you guys again for coming.